Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Baran, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Baran.
Welcome back to Early Returns, a podcast about law and politics. I'm your host, Jan Baran. Our producer is Jody Mayer Piazza. I'm very excited to have a guest today who is very experienced in law and politics. She's a graduate of Harvard Law School, worked in law firms, worked in election campaigns, worked in Congress as well as the Justice Department, and now she has a New York Times best-selling book. Sarah Isgur is the author of Last Branch Standing, which has the subtitle, A Potentially Surprising, Occasionally Witty Journey Inside Today's Supreme Court. Sarah also is editor of SCOTUS blog, a legal analyst for ABC News, and has the #1 podcast on law entitled Advisory Opinions, which she co-hosts with New York Times columnist David French, who also is a former practicing attorney. I don't have time to list all of her experiences. There are 25 entries on her LinkedIn profile, which I encourage our listeners to read. Sarah reminded me before this show that our paths crossed in the summer of 2007 when she was a summer associate at my prior law firm. She also reminded me that she won the scavenger hunt contest, which is quite an accomplishment when competing against 37 other high-achieving law students. Sarah, welcome to Early Returns, and thanks for making time to join us.
Thanks for having me. You know, the scavenger hunt is not a normal scavenger hunt that you give to 5-year-olds. There's a theme. You are expected to bribe the judges within the theme. So the theme was horror movies that summer. And I got each judge a bottle of rum and poured nail polish all over it and wrote creepy messages like, I will win this, in red nail polish. So it was red rum. Yeah.
Well, further proof that you excelled at so many things, especially during law school. Well, before we get to your book, I want to ask you a question about your time working in campaigns. You did so in part while you were a lawyer. In fact, during law school, you worked for the legal office of the Mitt Romney campaign for president, which was headquartered in Boston. So it must have been a short commute from Cambridge to wherever the headquarters was. But then years later, you were deputy campaign manager of Carly Fiorina's campaign. So you wore both hats. I'm kind of curious what you think is the difference between being a lawyer in politics versus being a political operative, and do the two roles mesh, or are they in conflict, or how do you reconcile all that?
So I've worked on a lot of campaigns, a lot of Senate races, and you're right. I've actually worked, I think, in every part of campaign world except fundraising. Never did any fundraising. I am terrible at that. Carly Fiorina used to tell me to leave the room when it would be time to meet with a donor because inevitably I would cost the campaign money. So I've done press, I've done ground game stuff. My favorite was probably my days doing opposition research. I loved being in the oppo shop. So I was in Romney in 2008 and in 2012, both in the legal shops for those. And in 2012, I was the election day operations person, which is sort of in between, right? On the one hand, I'm organizing all the lawyers around the country, both the paid and unpaid lawyers in all of these swing states, because you're getting ready for potential legal challenges on election day. And maybe more importantly, post 2000, you're getting ready for all the potential legal challenges after election day. If there's a state that comes down to the wire, you've got to make sure that you had all of your ducks in a row to be able to win that recount. Spoiler alert to all the listeners, we didn't go to a recount in 2012. So I spent 6 months on the road at one of my hotels, I don't even want to describe like how seedy some of these were. It was like there was a bathtub next to the bed and there was carpet under the bathtub and the mirror. And I was like, no, but I stayed there. So 6 months on the road, getting all of this stuff in order. And then election day comes, you sort of fight the best fights you can, these little skirmishes, and then it's over and someone wins or loses. That is very different than, say, the press world where you're fighting those little skirmishes, but you are trying to win the day every day for months and months. Opposition research, of course, is like the ninjas. people think opposition research and they think sex scandal. That is not the type of opposition research I did. I did financial scandals. I was going through your property records at the county courthouse, any mortgages that you might hold. But my favorite is just going through your voting record, because if you're a really good oppo person, it doesn't matter which way the candidate voted. You can paint them as either, against puppies or kittens, either way. And that type of work, it's long burn work, and then the payoff can be huge at the end. That was probably my favorite. So look, what I love about campaigns and why I tell young people, no matter what you want to be when you grow up, spending a summer working on a campaign or, a semester working on a campaign is a great idea. It is often the purest form of meritocracy that you will find in work that you do. There is more work to be done than anyone on staff can get done. And so you are constantly able to find more things to do to prove your value above your pay grade. And it's a team with an end date. And I loved having an end date because you can really push yourself further and further if you'd have that calendar on the wall, 100 days left, 99 days left, and you're counting down. And if you've ever seen the movie Gattaca, sorry, this is like an old one, but he would always say, like, how could you beat me, swimming out to the ocean? One of them was genetically engineered and the other one wasn't. And he would say, I would never leave anything for the way back. And that's what campaigns are. You never leave anything for the day after the campaign, because there isn't a day after the campaign. And no matter which part of the campaign you're in, you are part of that ethos. And that's fun.
Well, when you're a lawyer in a campaign, did you ever encounter a situation where your legal advice would be challenged or described as, gosh, you're interfering with our venture here to win the election? And on the other hand, when you were a politico, did you ever have a situation where you observed something going on in the campaign that, in your view, as a very educated lawyer, would react and think, wow, that's a legal problem. Do I have to bring this to somebody's attention?
I am almost certainly the worst client that an election lawyer can have. So apologies to all of my outside counsels. I'm a pain because you're right. I'm constantly second guessing them. I'm trying not to. I'm saying I'm not to, but I definitely am. Well, have you thought about it this way? Why wouldn't this work? And they're like, oh, thank you, Sarah. So yes, I think I've been in both of those situations. But, the lawyer's job is to find a way to say yes if you're a good lawyer, right? Not to say yes to what they asked you to do necessarily. That would make you a bad lawyer if it's unlawful. But to say, hey, I think I understand what you're trying to get accomplished. I have found you a different path to get there that is in compliance with the law. Because if you're a lawyer that's simply saying, nope, can't do it that way, and then that's where you stop the conversation, you're a bad lawyer, and you're definitely a bad campaign lawyer. You should not work in this business if that's your attitude, because again, this is a team sport. We're trying to get to this place. Help us get there as the lawyer.
Aren't there times when things are not really black and white? They're gray.
Sure.
I have to say that in my own lifetime experience in these types of situations, I'd like to always get the yes, but usually it's, what you have in mind isn't really possible, but there might be an alternative, but the alternative may not be clear cut. And by the way,
risk tolerance is
not
a
only
big part.
Risk tolerance, but I always try and make the point that if something goes wrong, I feel as a lawyer that I've done a good job when the client can't turn to me and say, well, you didn't warn me that this could happen. And that, I think, is a challenge that oftentimes lawyers don't experience in other contexts, especially when the pressure is so great and so important, or perceived to be important. Are we going to win? Are we going to lose? And by the way, all the political people, as you just observed, they all go home on election day, right? But the lawyer is still there cleaning up, and the candidate's still there.
Yes. The best example is from the Carly campaign. If you remember in 2016, this was the birth of the Super PAC campaign. And we knew, obviously, we would be an underdog in every sense. Fundraising, name ID, which if you have neither of those, you're in big trouble. And so we start with neither. And so to make that work, we were going to have to get really creative. about how our super PAC interacted with our campaign while complying with the law, which of course does not allow coordination between the two. And without getting into like all of the nerdy details, our super PAC was called capital CARLY for America, and our campaign was Carly for America. And the super PAC did all of the ground game. They paid for all of that and did all of that organizing. And the campaign, as again, I'm sure many of your listeners know, gets a discount on TV. So it made no sense to have your super PAC pay for the TV. But now you've got to spend that money that the super PAC can bring in, large amounts of money, wisely. And so we would say, for instance, Carly will be in West Des Moines on May 20th. And I would tweet that out. And then the super PAC would have to create an event for us on May 20th in West Des Moines. And so we were doing it all publicly, which is coordination that's allowed. But as you can imagine, talking to lawyers ahead of time to figure out the exact intricacies of how this was going to work and how this formula was going to happen each time, I got to tell you, as a lawyer, it was super fun, actually. But it involved all the things you're talking about. Finding a way to get to yes, explaining the risk tolerance, walking through what could potentially happen. And the biggest thing that could potentially happen did, which is the media noticed and wrote up stories saying that we were skirting the law while complying with the law. That the Wall Street Journal had a great quote from our head of the super PAC, which he said, "We can name this anything we want. We could name it Carly for Puppies if we wanted to." And that's the quote that ends up in the Wall Street Journal. I was like, so maybe we need a comms director for the super PAC. That might be a good idea. But yeah, I mean, that's an example of the interaction where the legal people were, I think, more front and center in the heartbeat of the campaign than any other campaign I'd worked on. Certainly than, the Senate races I was on or Romney, where you were running a traditional campaign and the lawyers were there to like keep the trains on the track. Here in Carly world, and for a lot of the campaigns in 2016, the lawyers were building the track while the train was moving on it.
Well, let's turn to your book, because that would be a good segue. These types of issues become legal issues. Sometimes they get all the way to the Supreme Court, not always. In my own experience, I worked on campaigns or in politics where actually the legal issue was first at the Federal Election Commission. Then it continued because my client didn't want to settle the case, and it went into court. And then I had one case that lasted 15 years and went to the Supreme Court twice as part of that process. And your book is timely. There's an awful lot of discussion publicly going on about the Supreme Court. Every day there's a story about some case or some motion that's being filed by somebody. Oftentimes it involves election issues, and certainly recently with redistricting and referenda and the Voting Rights Act. And your book provides an awful lot of interesting data about the 9 justices and the cases they've been deciding. But the press in general, for some time, has been saying that because 6 of the justices were appointed by Republican presidents and 3 by Democrats, that cases are usually decided 6-3 and therefore reflect a partisan court. You address that issue pretty directly in your book, in a very entertaining way, I might add. How would you respond to press characterizations of that sort?
Well, I have tried to make the book fun and entertaining for people who don't necessarily spend all of their time sitting in the Supreme Court pews there. I did have a friend's 13-year-old son. Like, he's really into the book. He says the footnotes are the best part. I think that might be because I use the word douche canoe in the book. And like, if you can't reach 13-year-old boys with creative cursing vocabulary, what have you really accomplished in life? So I'm particularly proud of that right now. But yes, we have this narrative about the Supreme Court that we've all just kind of accepted, that it is a 6-3 court. It always rules for Donald Trump. It is no different than Congress. There's a red team and a blue team. And that it's just not true. The data isn't there to bear that out. Last term, 15% of the cases were decided 6-3 or 5-4 along ideological lines with all of the liberal justices in dissent. That means 85% of the cases were not fitting that narrative. And by the way, the exact same number of cases, 15%, had all of the liberal justices in the majority with all conservative justices in dissent. So it's actually an exact split between liberals winning and conservatives winning. And you look at two justices like Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh, both Trump appointees. I mean, these guys are Federalist Society Petri dish lab experiments that have been released with excellent hair. And they only agreed with each other 50% of the time last term. In these closely divided cases, Justice Kavanaugh was more likely to agree with Justices Kagan and Sotomayor. And so if you want to engage in these conversations about the Supreme Court, if you disagree with a decision, me too. Like, I'm with you. There's plenty of decisions that I think they get wrong, but you've got to show me that you actually know how the court works and that ideological partisan narrative is not the best way to understand the court. You'll get it wrong 85% of the time. So I include these little mini bios of the justices. I included a different way to think about the court and the justices, not just along ideological lines, but along, I call it institutionalist lines. We can come up with a different title that's maybe better, but you've got to explain that difference between Gorsuch and Kavanaugh if you want to be able to predict how these cases are coming out. Because so far, Donald Trump has lost on every major policy initiative that has gone to the court. Alien Enemies Act on immigration, federalizing the National Guard, tariffs, obviously. He's going to lose on birthright citizenship. He's probably going to lose on Governor Cook at the Federal Reserve. The one case that I think he'll win on is whether you can fire people from the Federal Trade Commission. Okay, so he's one of 6? Wow. That would give him the worst record of any president in the history of the United States at the Supreme Court. But that doesn't fit the narrative, so we don't hear about it.
Well, this impression clearly is embedded in the public about the partisanship of the court. Statistically is not supportable, as you have just said. I think our listeners ought to know, if they don't already, that the court, in terms of its full docket, usually has somewhere around 65 cases. So not all 65 cases get a lot of press attention. I think it's fair to say that if you got a case about bankruptcy or admiralty law, it's just
even I skip those, in fairness.
But it strikes me in reading your book and taking a look at the cases, particularly recently, that the ones that do get attention either fall into cultural battle issues, abortion, right, gender issues and so forth, guns, or the ones that get a lot of press involve election law, campaign finance, redistricting, voting rights, and so forth. And it seems that in those cases, in the election law type cases, the partisan division seems to be pretty consistent, 6-3. And let me just add to that before I give you the microphone back. And that in my reaction is, that kind of explains in part to me why these Supreme Court appointments get so contentious, especially in the Senate. And it depends on who's controlling the Senate as well, which president is making the appointment and whether or not they are successful. The senators, in addition to these cultural issues, seem to be particularly interested in, how are they going to decide these election law cases? Because, by the way, it might affect my own reelection, right? So that's a, impression that I haven't really delved into it, although I did read in the last day or so, some political science professor has actually done an analysis and has sort of generally come up with exactly that type of proposition.
I've been waiting since 2007 to tell Jan Baran he's wrong about something. So I just want to bask in this moment of my glory 20 years later. I'm going to pick a very small piece of this to disagree with, and then I'll agree with the rest. You had mentioned the culture war cases being front and center, and guns as one of those. And this is the one part that I'll disagree with, because a lot of people will argue that the big cases are 6-3 along ideological lines. My evidence, I think, is that in fact, we see which cases are 6-3 along ideological lines and then declare those to be the big cases. And I'll give you an example that is about guns. Last term, there was a case about whether Smith & Wesson could be sued by the country of Mexico for gun violence caused by illegal gun trafficking into the country. country. And if that case had been 6-3 along ideological lines, I think it would be the Citizens United of gun violence. It would be, everyone would know the name of that case. It would be brought up every time there was a mass shooting in the United States. See, look, the conservatives prevented the gun manufacturers from being held liable. Instead, the case was unanimous and the decision was written by Justice Sotomayor. So we never heard about that case. And I'm told that therefore it's not a big case because see, look, it was unanimous. So by definition, it couldn't have actually been that hard, that important. But like it got to the Supreme Court because the lower court, smart judges across the country had disagreed on the question and had come out the other way. So I reject the big case narrative. I think that we have to find cases that fit our narrative and then use that to define the Supreme Court as ideological. That being said, there is ideology on the Supreme Court, right? I said 15% of the cases fell along ideological lines. 15% ain't nothing when we're talking about, taking only 60, 65 cases a year. And they are the biggest and the most contentious cases in the United States. And I think you've put your finger on something that we're almost always going to define the election law cases as big cases. They do seem to be more likely to divide along ideological lines. But again, there are exceptions. Allen v. Milligan upheld Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act a few years ago and demanded that Alabama redraw its congressional districts. And because that wasn't 6-3 along ideological lines, that case didn't get a lot of attention. And it wasn't, used by either partisan side then to rally supporters to vote for them, to hate the court, to, juice turnout in the next election. And so it really seems like it's only when either one tribal side or the other can whack the court that we really get the sort of civic education on what the court decided. But I think you're exactly right that of course senators care about those cases. It affects their election. If in any business, they don't seem to be in the legislative business, I'll tell you that, but they do seem to still be in the incumbent protection business. And I think you see a lot of that reflected when they put out press releases, how dare the Supreme Court decide the case this way? You're in Senate. Almost all of these cases are cases of statutory interpretation. Pass a new law. This question about whether Mississippi can accept ballots 5 days after the election, that is a question for Congress. All the Supreme Court is trying to do is tell us what they think Congress intended by the word election in federal law. If Congress doesn't like the way that case turns out, the next day they can propose a law to change it. And the Supreme Court will abide by that change. We've seen this happen. This is how the Voting Rights Act got amended. This is how the Lilly Ledbetter Act came into existence. But we as Americans no longer believe that Congress is responsible for legislating or able to legislate. And so when a case comes out like that and we see a press release from one party or the other decrying the Supreme Court's decision, we're like, oh yeah, I should give money to that guy. Instead of, dear God, what is that guy doing? I pay him to then fix what the Supreme Court just decided. They were just trying to read the law passed by a previous Congress. So I find all of that very annoying and frustrating. We're blaming the wrong branch.
Yeah, well, the title of your book, Last Branch Standing, is a reflection of your view, which people will agree with generally, that the other two branches aren't doing their job or not doing it the way they should. Congress is not passing legislation. And the president, whether it's Biden or Trump, regularly is trying to overreach through executive orders instead of executing laws that have been passed by Congress.
Yeah, the headline reads, Supreme Court strikes down Biden's student loan debt forgiveness. It should read, Supreme Court says Congress can pass student loan debt forgiveness any day of the week. No problems. We're open for business. It had nothing to do with student loan debt forgiveness. It had to do with the president's power. Same with Donald Trump's tariffs. Same with the Mississippi ballot case. Same with Donald Trump's asylum at the southern border case. You can be hard pressed to find a case that has made all of these headlines that is not at the end of the day a question of whether Congress will simply pass a law to be more clear about what they intend to do.
Well, that's also true of immigration and tariffs. Congress can pass everything, but they are not doing that. And it's deeply and intensely polarized. Do you have any view on what the heck is going to change? How does this get resolved?
So I am optimistic on a few fronts. One, the Supreme Court's approval rating is still well above that of the other two branches. That bar could not be lower when it comes to Congress or, frankly, the president, I suppose. But nevertheless, three branches of government, we're number one. We're number one. So it is the case that the American people do still seem to think that the court is doing an important job. And that job is counter-majoritarian, right? The court doesn't have a purpose, really. If it just goes along with what political majorities think, then we would be fine with just the other two branches that are majoritarian. They are supposed to reflect the will of voters. So we have a First Amendment to protect unpopular speech. We have a Fourth, Fifth, amendment to protect criminal defendants. These are unpopular groups, and those won't exist if we don't have a Supreme Court willing to stand against the majority of the moment. So the American people do seem to recognize that at some very deep cultural level. That's good. I also think the American people are starting to understand that this tribal war of all against all, negative polarization, it's not that you're voting for your team, it's that you're voting against the other team because they're here to destroy your way of life and your family and burn your homes and villages, isn't actually getting the results that anyone wants. It's getting kind of boring, frankly. It's jumped the shark, to actually use the real version from where that came from. And we're actually seeing it in our culture. Reality TV viewership has dropped off a cliff. Studios aren't producing new shows. They're canceling the ones that they've already had. And if we think politics is downstream from culture, maybe we'll be done with reality TV candidates too. And this idea that members of Congress, they're not going to compromise on the things you care about. They're going to stand for principle on Instagram. Maybe we'll be done with some of those guys too, raising small dollars by just stoking anger and outrage. And instead, voters will start rewarding the candidates that try to negotiate, try to solve problems through legislation and the stability and compromise that entails in a pluralistic society. But at the end of the day, we can blame the media, we can blame Congress, blame anyone you want. It's us. It's the voters. We're the problem. So unless we're voting in primaries and agreeing to vote for people who will compromise on the things we care about most, I don't know why we expect them not to react to the incentives that we've given them.
Well, I think that reality TV personalities have proven to be successful, especially the guy in the White House right now. And I also want to observe that there is a very interesting race for mayor of Los Angeles going on, where in fact the disruptor in that election seems to be a former reality TV actor. So I'm not sure that we're witnessing any signs of change in that.
We'll see. So
venue.
Look at the Democratic primary in Texas between Jasmine Crockett and James Tallarico. Jasmine Crockett was the more traditional reality TV candidate. A lot of anger and outrage, a lot of social media influencer type behavior. James Tallarico ran actually a very traditional grassroots ground game in Texas, was a much more optimistic, positive message. She was expected to win. He won in the end. That's one interesting part of this. But also look at that Los Angeles mayor's race. And yes, we are literally talking about a reality TV star in Spencer Pratt, but look at the message. It's no longer those people want to destroy your way of life. It's a very positive message. I call it the difference between House of Cards and Ted Lasso. The Ted Lasso candidates are suddenly doing far better. And this is the idea that actually everyone is a good person. Everyone's trying their best. When we disagree, it can be from places of good faith. I don't have to impugn your character or morals just because we don't agree on everything. Versus House of Cards. This is, a war of all against all. It's only about power. If I don't destroy you, you'll destroy me. So I need to destroy you first. That's the partisan gerrymandering fight that we're seeing right now with those politicians who represent that older form, the more reality TV form of politics that we've seen for the last decade. It's not to say that they've already lost. I'm just saying the ship is turning. Once voters really figure out that Congress could ban partisan gerrymandering tomorrow, it's going to be much harder for everyone to play these reindeer games and blame the court and blame the other side for gerrymandering their state. It's like, wait a second, we could stop all of this tomorrow? And so I think we're going to start seeing those positive Ted Lasso type candidates break through more and more. Again, are they going to all win every single seat in 2026? No, but a few in 26, 26, a few more in 28. And I think you're really, it's a slow ship of state. But these guys respond to incentives. And if they believe that voters will no longer respond to the anger and outrage, you watch how fast they'll drop that like a hot potato, and they will give voters what they think the voters want. The French Revolutionary, I must follow my people, for I am their leader.
Well, I want to comment about your book that it's very much like this conversation we're having. I mean, I want our listeners to know that this is not a work of fiction, number one, even though it's very entertaining and intriguing. And it's also, your book is not a slog through legal history and legal principles. It's what I would
It's a frolic through legal history and legal principles.
Well, it does go through that, but it's reader-friendly. It's conversational and informative. And you use real cases to sort of explain all the things that you are confronting in your book. And it reminds me of law school case books, but my goodness, it's so much easier to read and it's fun. And as I finished the book, I said, wow, that was great. And it does remind me a little bit of law school and why it's exciting to perhaps think about being a lawyer and understanding law. But my question is, did you always write this way? I mean, is this the way you wrote in law school when you were doing your final exams or law review articles?
I wish I could blame my poor grades on that. But no, my take on writing is that it's sort of like if you've learned to play a sport. I played viola for a long time, like quasi-professionally through college. In like 9th, 10th grade, I'd gotten pretty far and my form was bad though. And so I had to like undo the form and then back up a little bit, be worse than I was before to like rebuild the form. That's sort of what I think about writing. You're going to like learn how to write because you sort of have to write to communicate in the world. But at some point, you're going to have to decide like, nope, I'm going to back up. I'm going to super learn fundamentals. It's going to make me a really boring technical writer. But I spent some of the happiest years of my life cuddled up with Strunk and White, just getting really proficient at the rules of the game. And then after that, you get to have fun, have your own voice so that when you're breaking those rules, you're doing it knowingly and you can bring your audience along with you. But look, I wrote this book for myself. Truly, like I just made myself giggle a lot and that was fun. But if there's sort of a meta thing that can come out of this book, it's kind of along the same lines. It's this idea that you don't have to be an asshole to be successful in American politics right now. You can write a gracious, fun, happy warrior book and people actually will like it. And by the way, you could also be an expert in your field and still write a really successful book for people to actually enjoy. I think one of the fears that people have is that someone will think they're stupid if they're having too much fun, because to prove that you're smart, you have to be serious and speak in the lingo and have all the shibboleths. And I actually thought that like there would be academics, like legal academics who would say like Sarah's an idiot and doesn't actually understand this stuff. That hasn't been the reaction at all. I've been shocked. It's been really, really lovely to hear people say like, oh, wow, you can write about serious stuff, but make it fun to read. So I encourage everyone like, yeah, you can do it. Go do it.
Yeah, I have noticed that your book has not been attacked by the liberal academic establishment or the journalistic press. But I have, even in the last week, seen public statements made by professors about this issue regarding the partisanship of the Supreme Court. And each time I see a comment of that sort, it tells me that the person saying these things hasn't read your book. Otherwise, they would have had some nuance to what they were saying. Is your book available to, the faculty lounge at all these law schools?
I will tell you a little background of trying to write this book. It took me years to get an agent to agree to represent me, because what I kept hearing was you either need to be a person on the right who says why the left is evil, or you need to say that you've left the right, you're no longer a conservative, and here's why. It's because the right is evil. You have to have a partisan audience because that's what sells right now. That's what sells on social media. That's what sells for books. That's what sells for candidates. And I was like, that may be, but I am the wrong author for that. I can't do that. I'm not interested in it. I find it really boring. It's really easy to just cherry pick out the ways your side is right and their side is evil. It's much more intellectually engaging to take both sides at their best arguments, and wrestle with those and say like, ooh, this is actually hard because if you think about it this way, but then they'll say this and they think about it this way. And gosh, both sides are really making good arguments. That's why it's hard. That's why it gets to the Supreme Court. That's why justices of good faith can disagree, not because they're partisan, but because these have real arguments on both sides, not just caricatures of it. And so, look, a lot of people are being told that the only way that they can get followers, get traction, get on TV is by representing one tribe or the other. I've heard this from lawyers with clients, even clients, they like pitches that are like, yeah, that other side is evil. Dude, if you're hiring a lawyer that doesn't speak the other side as fluently as they speak your side, you have made a huge mistake in picking your counsel for that case. I would never hire someone to argue a case at the Supreme Court that can't, like a mina bird, be able to immediately speak fluent Alito and fluent Sotomayor. Because, it's sort of interesting. Back when we had that 5-4 court with Justice Kennedy in the middle, fine. You just needed to find an advocate that could argue to Justice Kennedy. That's it for almost everything. That's not true anymore. You have a 3-body problem at the Supreme Court. There are 3 swing votes. And in order to get one of them, you might lose another, or you might suddenly lose someone who you thought was a safe vote. And it makes it a really much more intellectually challenging, fun thing to argue a case at the Supreme Court right now. And yet I still see clients making these partisan choices on advocates and people standing up in front of the justices. There's one case in particular I'm thinking of, and look, doing this work is hard. I'm not going to pick on the advocate in question, but Justice Thomas asked his question, and this advocate guffawed into the microphone. You picked the wrong advocate if they are laughing at a justice's question. Even if you think you've already lost that justice, the other justices are friends. They care about each other. They're going to walk back to conference together. It's a misunderstanding of how the court works. So, yeah, it was a joy to get to write the book that I wanted to write, but it was also just I'm not going to spend time on something that doesn't sort of itch my brain in fun ways. And so steel manning the arguments for different sides is how I get my joy in life.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed writing it because I enjoyed reading it, and I highly recommend it to our listeners and anyone who asks. My wife wants to read your book next, so it's going to circulate in my family.
Well, if you have any 13-year-old boys around, just make sure you get them straight to the page with Douche Canoe.
Well, I have a 12-year-old grandson. And
perfect. There's a turd nugget in there, tell him. There's some of the best, he can't even get in that much trouble for using them curse words.
When I wrap up a conversation with a guest like this, I regularly ask, does my guest have any reading recommendations? And having read your book, I don't need to do that with you because your book has recommendations in it for people who would like to follow up on any of these topics. Some of these books have been written by Supreme Court justices. And so I urge listeners to keep that in mind as maybe another incentive to buy your book. But I know that, unfortunately, our time is up, and I know you have to run with another appointment. So I want to thank you, Sarah, for being on the podcast. I also want to thank our sponsor, the Holtzman Vogel Law Firm, for their support of this program. As usual, I have to say, any opinions expressed here are those of the host and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors or their clients. All of our episodes are available on Buzzsprout, as well as other podcast platforms such as Spotify and the National Law Review. I hope you will check them out. Thank you for listening and joining us, and I hope you join us on the next edition of Early Returns. Have a good day.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for not firing me when you had the chance.
Never. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Baran. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.